The first thing that happened was the temperature dropping. Not the slow, reasonable chill of a Boston winter, seeping through poorly insulated windows, but a sudden, violent plunge that turned my breath into white smoke. The second thing was the heavy, leather-bound copy of A Tale of Two Cities launching itself across the room and slamming into the exposed brick wall. Above my head, I did not scream. I did not drop my pen. I simply looked at the book lying on the hardwood floor. Its spine cracked, and then I looked at the entity that had thrown it. He was hovering approximately 4 inches off the ground, suspended in a pocket of unnatural shadows. He was dressed in the impeccable, tailored wool of the late 19th century. He wore a waistcoat, a cravat, and a coat that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings. His features were aristocratic sharp, and currently twisted into an expression of theatrical wrath. Lightning, which was entirely illogical given that it was snowing outside, seemed to crackle faintly around his translucent edges. He opened his mouth, and a sound like grinding stone and howling wind filled the small brownstone apartment. It was a very impressive display. If I had been the person I was 3 years ago, I might have been terrified. But I was not that person. I was a person who had spent the last 36 months living in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Massachusetts General Hospital. I was a person who had watched my mother slowly disappear into the machinery of terminal illness, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of medical debt and a cardboard box of personal effects. I had worked 3 jobs, slept in waiting rooms, and negotiated with insurance companies until my voice gave out. I did not have the energy to be haunted. My capacity for fear had been entirely bankrupted by the American healthcare system. A Victorian ghost with an attitude problem did not even register in my top 10 list of immediate concerns. I reached across my desk, picked up my noise-canceling headphones, and put them on. The howling wind cut out, replaced by the muffled, absolute silence of modern technology. Through the dim light of my desk lamp, I watched the ghost's expression shift. The theatrical wrath faltered. It was replaced by a look of profound, aristocratic offense. He floated a few inches closer, his translucent brow furrowing, as if he could not quite comprehend what he was seeing. I needed coffee. The spreadsheet glowing on my laptop screen, a meticulous, depressing catalog of collection agencies and minimum monthly payments, was not going to balance itself. I stood up. The ghost immediately puffed up his chest, the temperature in the room plummeting another 10 degrees. Frost began to crystallize on the edges of my laptop screen. He spread his arms, blocking the narrow pathway between my second-hand desk and the tiny kitchenette. He was making a statement. He was demanding to be acknowledged as the apex predator of this particular space. I looked at him. He looked at me, his chin raised in a posture of absolute, unyielding superiority. I walked directly through him. The sensation was deeply unpleasant. It felt like walking through a wall of freezing water and static electricity. A shudder racked my body, settling deep into my bones, but I kept my momentum. I reached the kitchen counter, picked up the battered aluminum percolator, and turned on the stove. Only then did I turn around to look at him. If a ghost could look scandalized, this one did. He had spun around to face me, his translucent hands clenched into fists at his sides. The glow around him was no longer a terrifying, spectral aura. It was vibrating with sheer indignation. He pointed a long, elegant finger at me, his mouth moving in what I could only assume were furious, archaic insults. I took off one side of my headphones. Sheer audacity, the absolute lack of decorum. I am Harrison Montgomery, heir to the Montgomery rail fortune, and you insolent, unwashed creature. I am making coffee. I interrupted. My voice sounded flat, scraped hollow by exhaustion. If you are going to keep dropping the temperature, could you do it near the refrigerator? The compressor is broken, and my milk is going to spoil. I put the headphone back on, cutting off whatever sputtering response he was forming. The brownstone apartment I had rented was absurdly cheap. When the landlord, a nervous man who refused to look me in the eye, handed over the keys and muttered something about plumbing issues and drafts, I had known there was a catch. In Boston, a brick-exposed studio with original hardwood floors for $800 a month did not exist without a catch. A ghost was a catch, but a ghost did not require a security deposit, and a ghost could not evict me. Therefore, Harrison Montgomery, heir to a defunct rail fortune, was simply going to have to deal with my presence. I poured my coffee, walked back across the room. I stepped slightly to the right this time, to avoid walking through him again, mostly because the static electricity had made my teeth ache. Then I sat back down at my desk. For the next 3 hours I worked. I categorized the debts. I calculated the interest. I tried to find a mathematical formula that would allow me to buy groceries and also keep the electricity running. In the corner of the room, near the ceiling, Harrison Montgomery hovered. He did not throw any more books. He did not howl. He simply watched me, his arms crossed over his tailored waistcoat, his dark, spectral eyes burning with a mixture of outrage and something that looked suspiciously like confusion. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the fear to set in. But there was no fear left. Around 2 in the morning, the numbers on the screen began to blur. The coffee turned cold in my mug. I rested my head on my arms, right on top of the keyboard, the plastic keys pressing into my cheek. The room was freezing, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust, but it was quiet. For the first time in 3 years, nobody was dying, and no machines were beeping. Just the silent, judgmental presence of a dead millionaire floating above my bookshelf. I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion finally pull me under. We had established our terms. The haunting, it seemed, was going to be a very quiet one. The quiet agreement I had struck with my resident poltergeist lasted exactly 4 days. During that time, Harrison Montgomery and I existed in a state of meticulously choreographed avoidance. I worked on my spreadsheets, drank my cheap coffee, and pretended not to notice when the temperature in the room plummeted. He hovered near the ceiling, arranged the shadows to suit his dramatic sensibilities, and pretended not to be deeply offended by my lack of terror. It was a functional system. It would have remained functional had it not been for a force far more invasive and terrifying than a Victorian ghost. My Aunt Martha. She arrived on a Saturday morning without warning. The sharp, rapid knocking on my door was the only prelude before she was letting herself in with the spare key the landlord had foolishly provided her for emergencies. An emergency, in Martha's vocabulary, was my continued existence as an unmarried, debt-ridden disappointment. "Ethan," she announced, stepping into the small entryway. She brought with her the overpowering scent of floral perfume and the crisp, judgmental air of suburban Ohio. Her eyes immediately began their assessment, cataloging the scuffed floorboards, the mismatched chairs, and the general state of my profound exhaustion. I was standing by the kitchenette, holding a half-eaten piece of toast. I did not have the energy for this. The headache that had been threatening my temples since Tuesday finally arrived, sinking its claws in behind my eyes. "Aunt Martha," I said, my voice rough. "What are you doing in Boston?" "Checking on my sister's only son clearly," she said, pulling off her leather gloves finger by finger. "Since you refuse to answer my calls. Look at this place, Ethan. It smells like damp masonry and old ozone. Are you keeping the windows open in December? It is freezing in here." It was freezing because Harrison Montgomery was currently hovering near the coat rack. I glanced toward the corner. Harrison was fully manifested, looking immaculate in his wool coat and cravat. He was staring at Aunt Martha with an expression of profound aristocratic disgust. She had walked right through the edge of his spectral aura, entirely oblivious, complaining about the draft. "The heating is inconsistent," I lied smoothly. "Your life is inconsistent," Martha corrected, walking further into the room and running a critical finger over the edge of my desk. "I spoke to your uncle. We can get you a job at the dealership back home. You can live in the basement. It is not much, but it is better than whatever this is. You cannot just hide from the world forever in a crumbling brownstone, Ethan. You are isolating yourself. It is unhealthy. You are entirely alone." The word alone echoed in the small room. It was not spoken with malice, but with a heavy, suffocating pity that felt worse than a physical blow. She was looking at me the way everyone looked at me after the funeral, like a broken thing that needed to be managed. The headache flared violently. I wanted her to leave. I needed her to leave so I could go back to the quiet, freezing peace of my spreadsheets. My brain, starved of sleep and desperate for an exit strategy, bypassed logic entirely and grabbed the first available weapon. "I am not alone," I said. Martha paused, her hand hovering over a stack of medical bills. "Excuse me," I said. "I am not alone. I do not live here by myself." I took a bite of my cold toast, chewing methodically to buy time. Harrison, who had been glaring at a water stain on the ceiling, suddenly lowered his gaze to look at me. The air in the room grew very still. "You have a roommate?" Martha asked, her tone sharpening with suspicion. She scanned the studio apartment. "Where are they then?" "Hiding in the bathroom." I corrected, leaning against the counter. "And no, he is in the bedroom. He is my partner. My boyfriend." Martha stared at me. Harrison stared at me. The sheer, unadulterated shock on the Victorian ghost's face would have been comical if my heart was not currently hammering against my ribs. "A boyfriend," Martha repeated slowly. "You have not dated anyone in 3 years. You barely have time to sleep. And now you expect me to believe you are living with someone in this drafty closet. Who is he?" I looked directly at the corner where Harrison was floating. "His name is Harrison," I said. "He is from old money. Very old money, railroads actually." Harrison's spectral jaw dropped. "Railroads?" Martha scoffed, crossing her arms. "If he has so much money, why are you living here?" "He has a complicated relationship with his family's wealth." I improvised, the lie rolling off my tongue with the smooth, desperate ease of a man who has nothing left to lose. "And he is incredibly private. In fact, he suffers from severe social anxiety, agoraphobia mostly. He does not handle guests well, which is why he has not come out to say hello." Martha's eyes narrowed. She was a woman who required physical evidence. She took a step toward the partially open door of the bedroom. Ethan, she said, her voice dropping into the patronizing register she reserved for unruly children. If you are making up an imaginary boyfriend just to stop me from worrying about you, it is pathetic. If there is a real person in that room, I am going to introduce myself. She took another step. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through my exhaustion. If she walked into that bedroom and found it completely empty, the lecture would never end. She would pack my bags herself. She would drag me back to Ohio. I opened my mouth to stop her, to confess the lie, but the words died in my throat. The temperature in the apartment did not drop this time. Instead, the air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating pressure. I watched as Harrison Montgomery descended slowly from the ceiling. He drifted until he was standing on the floor, his tall frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the morning light. He looked at me. He did not look angry anymore. He looked at me with an expression of profound, devastating pity. I could almost hear the aristocratic sneer in his silence. Poor, wretched mortal. So desperate, so deeply pathetic, that you must invent my presence to shield yourself from your own miserable reality. Very well. I shall grant you your dignity. Harrison turned his gaze toward the bedroom door. He raised one elegant, translucent hand. Before Martha could take a third step, the heavy oak door of the bedroom began to move. It did not slam. It swung shut with a slow, deliberate smoothness, gliding on its hinges until it met the frame. A loud click echoed through the room. The sound of the brass lock sliding into place echoed through the quiet apartment. It was loud. It was undeniable. Martha stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at the closed, locked door, her face draining of color. "He is very shy," I said into the absolute silence. My voice was perfectly flat. "I told you." Martha stood there for another 10 seconds, processing the irrefutable evidence of a locked door. Slowly, she took a step back, her hostility deflating into awkwardness. "I see, well, I suppose I should not intrude on his condition." "Probably for the best," I agreed. 5 minutes later, she was gone, leaving behind a flurry of hurried goodbyes and a promise to call next week. When the front door finally shut behind her, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy and charged. I stood in the kitchenette. I looked at the locked bedroom door. Then, I looked at the ghost standing in the center of my living room. Harrison Montgomery smoothed the lapels of his ghostly coat, his chin raised in a posture of immense, self-satisfied magnanimity. He had saved me, and we both knew exactly what that meant. I had given him a reason to exist in this space, and he had taken it. The quiet haunting was over. The performance had just begun. The heavy oak door of the bedroom remained locked for 3 hours after Aunt Martha's departure. When it finally clicked open, there was no dramatic gust of wind, no sudden drop in temperature. Harrison Montgomery simply floated back into the living room with the quiet, insufferable dignity of a man who had just performed a highly charitable act and expected to be recognized for it. I did not thank him aloud. I suspected that saying the words would break the fragile, bizarre truce we had just established. Instead, I went back to my spreadsheets, and he went back to hovering near the ceiling. But the rules of engagement had changed. The quiet haunting had evolved into a silent partnership, built entirely on a foundation of mutual, unspoken pity. The shift became undeniably apparent the following morning. I woke up, dragged myself out of bed, and walked into the kitchenette, expecting the usual depressing sight of unwashed coffee mugs and scattered utility bills. The mugs were clean. The bills were stacked in a perfect, sharp-edged rectangle on the corner of the counter. And the floor, which usually held a permanent layer of Boston winter grit, was immaculately swept. I looked at the broom, which was leaning innocently against the wall. Then I looked up at Harrison, who was currently examining his translucent fingernails with a look of supreme boredom. He was role-playing. He had taken the fictional identity I had given him, the reclusive, wealthy boyfriend, and decided to execute it with Victorian precision. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy somewhere beneath my exhaustion. He has been dead for over a century, I thought, watching him pretend not to look at me. He is trapped in this crumbling brownstone, completely forgotten by the world. He is so desperately lonely that a lie told to an obnoxious aunt is enough to give him a sense of purpose. He needs to feel useful. I decided it was my moral obligation to indulge him. On my way home from my shift at the hospital archives that evening, I bought a pack of yellow sticky notes. I stuck one to the refrigerator door, right at his eye level. I wrote on the note, "Thank you for the cleaning, but you do not have to play the maid to justify your presence here. You can just exist." I went to take a shower. When I came back, there was a new note stuck perfectly below mine. The handwriting was not mine. It was a sweeping, aristocratic copperplate script, executed with my cheap blue ballpoint pen. The sheer force required for a spirit to manipulate a physical pen must have been immense, but the ink strokes were flawless. The note read, "I am a Montgomery. We do not abide squalor. Do not flatter yourself into assuming. I exerted my energy for your benefit. Wretched creature, I simply refuse to be associated with a pigsty." I stared at the elegant handwriting. A small, unfamiliar sound escaped my throat. It took me a moment to realize it was a laugh. It was dry and cracked from disuse, but it was a laugh nonetheless. Of course, I thought. He has his pride. He cannot just admit he wants to take care of someone. I wrote a reply and stuck it to the fridge before going to sleep. I wrote, "Understood. My apologies to the Montgomery aesthetic." By the end of the week, the refrigerator door was covered in yellow squares. We did not speak to each other. The silence was safer. It allowed us both to maintain our respective illusions. My next note read, "The radiator is broken again. I am leaving for work. Try not to freeze the pipes." His response was prompt. "Your lack of faith in my atmospheric control is insulting. The pipes are fine. Buy better coffee. The smell of your current brew is an offense to my spectral senses." The coffee comment bothered me more than it should have. I looked at my bank account on Friday afternoon. I had $14 left to survive the weekend. I needed to buy bread, eggs, and instant ramen. Instead, I walked into a specialty tea shop on Newbury Street. I spent $11.50 on a small tin of imported Earl Grey loose-leaf tea. It was a financially suicidal decision. It was the most irrational thing I had done in 3 years. When I got home, I placed the black tin squarely on the center of the kitchenette counter. I wrote a note and pressed it to the metal lid. For the agoraphobic boyfriend, I do not know if ghosts can smell tea, but the reviews said it was very Victorian. I did not wait to see his reaction. I turned my back, changed into my sweatpants, and climbed into bed. Before Harrison, I used to sleep sprawled out, claiming the entire mattress in a desperate attempt to find comfort. That night, without consciously thinking about it, I shifted to the far left side of the mattress. I smoothed the blanket on the right side, leaving a perfectly flat, empty space. It is just to make him feel welcome, I told myself, staring at the peeling paint on the wall. He needs to feel like he has a place in the world. About 20 minutes later, the air in the bedroom shifted. The temperature dropped, but it was not the violent, biting cold of his anger. It was a controlled, localized chill, like the surface of a frozen lake on a windless night. I felt the mattress dip, infinitesimally, on the right side. I did not turn around. I closed my eyes, feeling the ambient frost radiating against my back. It was not uncomfortable. It was steady. It was a physical anchor in a life that had felt adrift for far too long. On the other side of the bed, Harrison Montgomery settled into the shadows. I was certain he was looking at my back, thinking about how pathetically dependent I was on his presence, how deeply in love I must be to spend my last $10 on tea for a dead man. I was certain he felt immensely smug and magnanimous for lowering himself to share a bed with a mortal just to soothe my fragile heart. And I felt exactly the same way about him. We were both terrible liars, and as the cold Boston wind rattled the window panes, we both fell asleep, intensely satisfied with our own nobility. Noah arrived on a Tuesday evening in late January, dragging a battered duffel bag and a cloud of nicotine and misery. Noah and I had been friends since college. He was a tattoo artist with a shaved head, an imposing collection of neck ink, and an unfortunate habit of dating people who actively made his life worse. He also possessed a very mild, highly inconvenient psychic sensitivity that he mostly used to avoid renting apartments with bad energy. 2 days, he said, dropping his bag onto my entryway floor, 3 max, just until Derek moves his stuff out of my place. I swear I am not going to be a burden. It is fine, I said, stepping aside to let him in. The sofa pulls out. It is terrible for your back, but it is free. Noah walked into the living room, stopped dead in his tracks, and stared at the ceiling corner above the bookshelf. I followed his gaze. Harrison Montgomery was hovering there, wearing a spectral expression of absolute, unadulterated snobbery. He looked at Noah's neck tattoos the way a health inspector might look at an active biohazard. "Ethan," Noah said slowly, not taking his eyes off the corner, "why is there a Gilded Age aristocrat judging my life choices from your ceiling?" "Oh," I said. I had forgotten that Noah could sometimes see things. "That is Harrison. He lives here." "He does not live here," Noah corrected, his voice tight. "He is dead, and he is glaring at me. He glares at everyone. It is his default setting. Just ignore him." I went to the kitchenette to make coffee. Noah stayed glued to the spot for another minute before cautiously moving toward the sofa. He sat down, pulled out his phone, and tried to look busy. Over the next 48 hours, Noah became the reluctant, traumatized audience to a performance he never bought tickets for. The problem with our silent partnership, the intricate dance of mutual pity that Harrison and I had constructed, was that it only made sense if you were one of the 2 people participating in it. To an outside observer, it looked entirely unhinged. On Wednesday morning, Noah was sitting at the small dining table, trying to eat cereal, when the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The tin of Earl Grey tea slid smoothly across the counter, stopping exactly next to my favorite mug. The kettle clicked on by itself. "Thank you," I said softly to the empty space near the fridge. I kept my voice gentle, the kind of tone you use with a stray cat you are trying not to spook. Poor thing, I thought. He is trying so hard to be helpful. I must validate his efforts so he does not feel useless. Noah dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly against his bowl. "Ethan," he whispered, looking terrified, Are you baby-talking the ghost?" "I am not baby-talking," I snapped, keeping my voice low. "I am being appreciative. He has severe abandonment issues and a complex about his lack of physical agency. I am giving him structure." Up near the ceiling, Harrison crossed his arms, looking immensely satisfied. I could practically read his mind. Look at this pathetic mortal, defending me to his vulgar friend. He is utterly dependent on my presence. It is my noble duty to humor his desperate affections. "Structure," Noah repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "Ethan, he just rolled his eyes at you." I literally saw him roll his eyes. "He looks like he wants to charge you rent for breathing his air." "You do not understand him," I said defensively, pouring the hot water over the tea leaves. "I understand that you are both insane," Noah muttered, returning to his cereal. The breaking point came on Thursday evening. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the endless rows of my financial spreadsheet. The numbers were blurring again. I rubbed my temples, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. Suddenly, a yellow sticky note fluttered down from the ceiling, landing squarely in the center of my laptop keyboard. I picked it up. In that flawless, aristocratic copperplate, it read, "Your incessant sighing is disrupting the atmospheric equilibrium. Go to sleep, you fragile creature, before you expire at your desk, and I am forced to haunt you for eternity." I read the note. I felt that familiar, strange warmth blooming in my chest. He is worried about my health, I thought, carefully folding the note and putting it in my desk drawer. He is just too proud to say it directly. I should go to bed so he stops stressing over me. I stood up stretched and turned off the desk lamp. "I am going to bed," I announced to the room. "Good night, Noah, good night, Harrison." From the sofa, Noah watched me, then he looked up at the ceiling. "I cannot take this anymore," Noah said. His voice strained. He stood up, grabbed his duffel bag, and started shoving his things inside. "What are you doing?" I asked, startled. It is 11 p.m. Derek has not moved out yet. I would rather sleep on Derek's floor while he aggressively plays Call of Duty than spend another minute in this apartment, Noah declared, zipping his bag with unnecessary force. He walked to the front door, opened it, and then turned around to look at me. His expression was a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep pity. "Ethan," Noah said, enunciating every word, "he is not an abandoned stray cat who needs your protection. He is a Victorian snob who is using telekinesis to make you tea because he likes you. And you are not a fragile Victorian maiden who needs to be protected from a spreadsheet. You are letting a ghost nag you into a healthy sleep schedule because you like him." I stared at Noah. The hallway light cast a harsh shadow over his face. "Both of you," Noah continued, gesturing vaguely between me and the ceiling, "need to stop pretending that the other person is the tragic, pathetic one in this dynamic. You are both equally pathetic, and it is sickeningly romantic. Good night." He slammed the door behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the comfortable, choreographed silence we had grown used to. It was a loud, ringing silence. I did not look at the corner where Harrison was hovering. I did not look at the sticky notes on the fridge. I walked very quickly into the bedroom, shut the door, and got into bed, staying rigidly on the far left side. 20 minutes later, the temperature dropped. The mattress dipped on the right side. But this time, I did not feel smug. I did not feel noble. Noah's words echoed in the dark room, stripping away the comfortable illusion I had wrapped myself in. "Because you like him." I closed my eyes, the ambient frost radiating against my back, and realized, with a sense of quiet, terrifying clarity, that my friend with the bad neck tattoos was absolutely right. For 3 days after Noah left, the brownstone was unbearably quiet. The sticky notes vanished. The tin of Earl Grey remained untouched on the counter. When I went to bed, the mattress still dipped on the right side, and the ambient frost still settled against my back. But the comfortable, smug illusion of our mutual pity was gone. We were no longer two noble souls humoring each other. We were two desperately lonely people who had been caught in a lie, too stubborn to admit the truth, and too terrified to break the silence. The breaking point arrived on Friday evening. It did not come from within the apartment. It came from the hallway. It started with a pounding on the door. Not the sharp, authoritative knock of Aunt Martha, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of a fist against cheap wood. I was sitting at my desk, staring blindly at my laptop. I assumed it was the landlord coming to complain about the fluctuating temperatures. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. It was not the landlord. It was a man in a damp leather jacket, smelling of stale tobacco and cheap cologne. He was broad-shouldered, with the kind of aggressively blank expression that usually belonged to people who hurt others for a living. I recognized him instantly. He was a field agent for the predatory lending company my mother had desperately borrowed from during her final year of treatments. "Ethan," he said, It was not a greeting. It was a confirmation of a target. He wedged the toe of his heavy boot into the doorframe before I could even process the threat. You have not been returning our calls. The agency is losing its patience. I sent the minimum payment on Tuesday, I said, my voice tight. I tried to push the door closed, but he did not budge. The minimum does not cover the new interest rate, he said, stepping forward. His mass forced me to stumble backward into the apartment. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He looked around the cramped, peeling studio with a sneer. You owe us $30,000. You are going to start liquidating what you have, or we are going to start making your life very, very difficult. He reached out and grabbed the collar of my shirt. He was bigger than me, well-fed and violent. I was running on 3 hours of sleep-cheap ramen and 3 years of cumulative exhaustion. I did not fight back. I did not try to punch him. I just froze, my brain entirely short-circuiting, waiting for the inevitable physical impact. The impact never came. Instead, the air in the apartment imploded. There was no gradual drop in temperature. It was instantaneous, a violent plunge into Arctic freezing that made the windows crackle. The single bulb overhead exploded in a shower of glass, plunging the room into shadows. The man holding my collar gasped, his breath turning to thick white smoke. He let go of me, his eyes widening in sudden, primal terror as he looked past my shoulder. I did not need to turn around to know what was happening. I could feel it, the sheer, overwhelming pressure of a supernatural entity gathering every ounce of its displaced gravity. Harrison Montgomery did not hover. He materialized directly in front of the man, solid and terrifying. His aristocratic features were contorted into an expression of absolute, murderous fury. He did not look like a Gilded Age snob anymore. He looked like a force of nature, a localized hurricane contained within the silhouette of a man. Harrison raised one hand. He did not touch the debt collector. He did not need to. An invisible, crushing force slammed into the man's chest. The collector was lifted entirely off his feet and hurled backward with the velocity of a car crash. He flew through the air, crashing through the heavy wooden front door, splintering the frame, and landing in a broken heap in the hallway outside. Harrison lowered his hand. The shattered remnants of the door slammed shut on their broken hinges. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, metallic screech, the brass twisting and warping to lock the door permanently in place. From the hallway, there was the sound of scrambling boots, followed by panicked, retreating footsteps echoing down the stairwell. The apartment fell dead silent. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard it ached. I leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to draw oxygen into my frozen lungs. Harrison. I gasped out, Harrison, what did you do? I turned around. The words died in my throat. Harrison was not standing triumphantly. He was on his knees. The immaculate details of his Victorian clothing were gone. The sharp lines of his face were blurring, dissolving into static. He was not translucent anymore. He was terrifyingly transparent. I could see the exposed brick wall directly through his chest. Harrison, I dropped to my knees beside him. The instinct to maintain our emotional distance evaporated entirely. I reached out to grab his shoulders, to pull him up, but my hands met nothing but biting, freezing air. My fingers passed right through him. He looked up at me. The arrogant, self-satisfied ghost was gone. His spectral eyes were wide, filled with a profound, disorienting panic. The wallpaper, he whispered. His voice did not echo. It sounded thin, like a radio signal losing its frequency. The wallpaper in my mother's drawing room. I cannot remember the pattern. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice cracking. I kept trying to hold his hands, my own fingers going numb from the supernatural cold, desperate to find something solid. Harrison, look at me. What is happening to you? He looked at his own fading, transparent hands. A bitter, heartbreaking smile touched the corners of his mouth. A spirit has no physical mass, Ethan. He whispered, his voice fading with every syllable. To affect the mortal plane, to exert force, it requires fuel. We must burn our anchors. We must burn our memories. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The tea-tin moving, the sweeping of the floors, the slamming of the doors. Every time he had interacted with the physical world, to humor me, to protect me, he had been burning pieces of his own identity. And just now, to throw a grown man across the room. You burned it. I choked out a raw, terrifying panic clawing up my throat. To protect me, you burned your own memories. I cannot remember her face, Harrison murmured, looking through me, his image flickering like a dying candle. I cannot remember my mother's face. He closed his eyes, his chin dropping to his chest, and began to fade into the shadows of the freezing room. The lie was dead. The performance was over. And as I knelt on the floor, desperately trying to hold onto a ghost who was slipping out of existence, I realized I would burn the rest of my own life to the ground if it meant keeping him here. I did not sleep that night. I could not. The apartment was freezing, but not the localized, controlled chill of a ghost making a point. It was the ambient, lifeless cold of a room that was slowly emptying out. Harrison had retreated to the darkest corner of the bedroom, curling into a space between the wall and the heavy oak wardrobe. He was barely visible. If I squinted, I could make out the faint, staticky outline of his shoulders, flickering erratically like a broken television screen. I tried everything I could think of. I scoured the internet for hours, frantically typing into forums about Victorian hauntings, spiritual anchors, and energy transference. The glow of the laptop screen felt harsh against my burning, exhausted eyes. I bought cheap, bitter sage from the 24-hour bodega down the street and burned it until the apartment smelled like a campfire. I opened my mother's old Bible and read Psalms aloud, my voice cracking in the empty room. Nothing worked. Harrison did not move. He did not materialize to complain about the smell of the sage or critique my reading voice. He was just fading. By 3 in the morning, the frantic energy inside me burned out, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of terror. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the floor, about 3 feet away from the flickering shadow that was Harrison Montgomery. "Harrison," I said. My voice sounded loud and abrasive in the quiet. He did not respond. The static of his outline merely pulsed, weak and irregular. "Stop it," I said, my voice hardening. Not with anger, but with desperation. "Stop fading. You have to stop." Silence. "I know you can hear me," I pushed, leaning forward. "You need to pull yourself together. You survived a century in this awful building. You cannot just disappear because you threw one pathetic debt collector through a door." The shadow in the corner shifted. A voice, thin and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic resonance, drifted toward me. "It was not just the door, Ethan," Harrison whispered. "It was the tea, the floors, the locks, the temperature. Every time I made myself known to you, I burned a fraction of my anchor. The door was simply the final, largest expenditure." I stared at the spot where his face should have been. "Why?" I demanded, the word ripping out of my throat before I could stop it. "Why would you do that? You are a Montgomery. You have a massive ego. You think everyone is beneath you. Why would you destroy your own existence to make my tea?" The faint outline of his head turned toward me. Even without seeing his features clearly, I could feel the weight of his gaze. "Because I was protecting you," he said. The thinness of his voice made the words sound fragile, like old glass. "You are a fragile, exhausted creature. You have nothing. You invented my presence simply to shield yourself from your own pitiful loneliness. What was I supposed to do? Leave you to freeze in your own miserable reality? You would not survive without the meager comfort I provided." His words were supposed to be insulting, but they only broke whatever remaining restraint I had. "Protecting me?" I laughed. It was an ugly, broken sound. "You think I needed your protection. You think I invented you because I was lonely." The static flickered, a faint pulse of confusion. "Your aunt," he started. "I lied to my aunt because she was annoying me and my head hurt," I shouted, the volume of my voice echoing off the brick walls. "I did not invent you for comfort. I played along because I thought you needed it." Harrison went completely still. "What?" "You have been trapped here for over 100 years, I said, the words spilling out in a rapid, messy confession. "You are dead, Harrison. Everyone you ever knew is gone. You were hovering around my apartment, trying to act like a terrifying poltergeist, but you just looked desperate to be noticed. I played along with the boyfriend lie because I thought it gave you a purpose. I thought you were so pathetically lonely that you needed an excuse to be part of someone's life." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the comfortable silence of our shared delusion. It was the ringing, deafening silence of the truth finally hitting the floor between us. The static of his form rippled violently. When he spoke, his voice was stronger, threaded with a sudden, raw indignation. "You pitied me?" Harrison asked. "Yes," I yelled back. "And you pitied me. We spent the last month acting like martyrs, pretending to tolerate each other just to feel noble. It was a joke. It was a massive, stupid joke." I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my arms. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving me shivering and hollow. "And the tea," Harrison's voice was closer now. He had moved out of the corner. "You spent your last $11 on Earl Grey. Was that pity, Ethan?" I kept my face hidden. I thought about the dip in the mattress, the ambient cold against my back, the sticky notes on the fridge that I had read over and over again. "No," I whispered into my arms. "It was not pity." A long moment passed, then, the air directly in front of me grew freezing cold. I lifted my head. Harrison was kneeling on the floor, inches away from me. He was still transparent, still flickering, but his spectral eyes were locked onto mine with a terrifying, agonizing clarity. "Then what was it?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Tell me the truth, Ethan, because I have burned my mother's face to keep you safe, and I will not fade away into nothingness on a lie." I looked at the ghost kneeling before me. I looked at the man who had traded his memories for my safety. The armor was gone. We were just two exposed nerves in a freezing room. It was not pity, I said, my voice breaking. It was because I did not want you to be alone anymore. And because I did not want to be alone either. Harrison stared at me. He raised a trembling, translucent hand, reaching toward my face. His fingers hovered millimeters from my cheek, close enough for me to feel the biting cold of his essence. He did not touch me. He did not have the energy left to make contact. He simply lowered his hand, closed his eyes, and bowed his head. What a tragic, magnificent pair of fools we are, the ghost of Harrison Montgomery whispered. And then, he flickered and vanished entirely into the dark. When a ghost vanishes, he does not leave behind an empty space. He leaves behind a vacuum. For 36 hours, the brownstone apartment was nothing but a poorly insulated box of brick and plaster. The radiator clanked aggressively. The drafts from the windows smelled only of Boston exhaust and impending snow, entirely devoid of ozone or ancient cedar. I went to my shift at the archives. I categorized files. I rode the subway home. I did all the things a functional, living human being was supposed to do, but I moved through the hours with the heavy, dragging sensation of a man walking underwater. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It was the kind of silence I had craved for 3 years while living in hospitals, but now that I had it, it felt like a punishment. I did not try to summon him again. I did not burn sage or yell into the corners. If Harrison Montgomery had burned the last of his existence, to save me from a bruised jaw, screaming at the empty air was not going to bring him back. Saturday morning arrived, pale and freezing. Snow had begun to fall overnight, coating the city in a thick, muffling blanket of white. I got out of bed. I walked into the kitchenette. I did not look at the spreadsheets. Instead, I took out a small pot and heated a can of soup. I boiled water. I opened the black tin of Earl Grey tea and measured out the loose leaves with meticulous care, letting them steep for exactly 4 minutes. I carried the bowl of soup and the steaming mug of tea to the small dining table. I set them down on the side opposite my chair. Then I sat down, folded my hands on the cheap laminate wood, and waited. It was not a ritual. It was simply an offering of reality. I am here, the gesture said, and there is a space for you. 10 minutes passed. The soup stopped steaming. Then, the ambient air in the room shifted. It was not the violent, dramatic plunge of a poltergeist trying to prove a point. It was a slow, steady cooling, like stepping out of the harsh sun into the shade of a very old tree. The chair across from me scraped backward against the floorboards, moving exactly 3 inches. I looked up. Harrison was there. He was incredibly faint, his edges bleeding into the morning light, but he was sitting in the chair. He looked exhausted. The sharp, aristocratic arrogance that usually defined his posture was gone, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of someone who has run a very long distance and has nowhere left to go. He looked at the tea, then he looked at me. I did not fade, he said. His voice was no more than a whisper, lacking its usual resonant echo, but it was steady. I can see that, I said. My own voice shook slightly, betraying the tight, painful knot that was finally loosening in my chest. Harrison kept his gaze fixed on the table. A spirit is tethered to the mortal plane by memory, Ethan. The memory of who we were, the memory of the spaces we occupied. When I used my energy against that man, I burned the memory of my mother's face. I burned the layout of my childhood estate. I burned the scent of the rail yards that built my family's fortune. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. They were dark spectral and devastatingly human. I thought that would be the end of it, he continued softly. But as the void approached, I realized something. I was not anchored to this brownstone because of my history. Not anymore. I was anchored here because a terribly exhausted, stubborn man told his aunt that I was his partner. You gave me a name in the present tense. You gave me a place. And for a ghost who has been forgotten for a century, being real to someone living is a gravity stronger than any history. I stared at him, the weight of his confession settling over me. We had spent weeks hiding behind irony and false nobility, but there was nowhere left to hide. I stood up. I walked over to the cardboard box in the corner of the room, the box that held the meager remnants of my life before the hospital. I dug past the old photographs and the unpaid medical bills until my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a silver mechanical pocket watch. It had belonged to my grandfather. It was heavy tarnished, and it still kept perfect time. It was the only thing of actual value I had refused to liquidate. I walked back to the table. I did not try to grab Harrison's translucent hand. Instead, I placed the heavy silver watch flat on the table, right next to his cup of Earl Grey tea. You burned your past, I said, my voice quiet but entirely certain. You do not have historical anchors anymore, so you need a new one. Harrison looked down at the watch. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the mechanical gears was loud in the quiet room. Take it, I told him. You are not bound to the brownstone anymore, Harrison. You are bound to my time. He stared at the silver casing for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached out. His translucent, flickering fingers hovered over the watch. He closed his eyes, took what looked like a ragged breath, and pressed his hand flat against the metal. The reaction was instantaneous. The loud ticking of the watch seemed to catch, echoing wildly for a split second before syncing perfectly with the subtle, atmospheric hum of his presence. A wave of cold air washed over the table, carrying the sharp, clean scent of ozone and winter pine. Before my eyes, the static disappeared. The transparency vanished. The sharp lines of his face, the dark wool of his coat, the intricate knot of his cravat, they all solidified, drawing density and color from the air itself. He was not human, he was not warm, but he was undeniably, permanently there. Harrison opened his eyes. They were solid and dark. He slowly pulled his hand back from the watch, staring at his own opaque fingers with a look of profound wonder. Then, very deliberately, he reached out and picked up the mug of Earl Grey. His fingers wrapped around the ceramic. He lifted it to his lips, took a sip, and lowered it back to the table with a soft, physical clink. He looked at me, an unmistakable glimmer of his old, insufferable arrogance returning to his features. "You steep this for 4 minutes," Harrison noted, his voice once again carrying that rich, aristocratic resonance. 3.5 is the maximum for this particular blend, Ethan. You have over-extracted the tannins. I let out a breath that I felt like I had been holding for 3 years. A genuine, unrestrained smile broke across my face, cracking the last of the exhaustion that had been calcified over my bones. "Next time," I said, sitting back down in my chair, "you can make it yourself." Harrison Montgomery, heir to a defunct rail fortune, and permanent resident of my present tense, offered a small, devastatingly fond smile. "I believe I will," he said. Outside, the Boston snow continued to fall, burying the loud, frantic city in a deep, quiet white inside. The radiator clanked, the mechanical watch ticked, and the air smelled faintly of tea and winter chill. I had stumbled into this crumbling apartment with nothing left to give, and somehow, across a century of silence and a barrier of death, I had found exactly what I needed to stay.